I'd been itching to get out of the city for months, the constant hum of traffic and voices grating on my nerves. So, when I finally got some time off, I packed my gear and headed out to Washington State. I'd hiked those trails before, peaceful, quiet, the kind of place where you can be alone with your thoughts. A little too alone, it would turn out. The first day had gone smoothly. The air was crisp, the trees thick, and the trail winding. I'd planned a route that would take me deep into the forest, a place where few hikers ventured. I had enough supplies to last a few days, and I was looking forward to a bit of solitude. It was late afternoon when I first saw him. I rounded a bend in the trail, and there he was, just standing there. He wasn't carrying any gear. No pack, no water bottle, nothing. He didn't even look dressed for hiking. Just a plain flannel shirt, jeans, and boots that looked like they'd seen better days. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and he didn't seem to belong there, like he'd just wandered in from some other time and place. He didn't say anything, just stared at me, a half smile curling on his lips, but it wasn't a friendly one. It was wrong, like he knew something I didn't. I nodded at him, polite, like you do when you pass someone on the trail, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, his eyes following me as I walked by. I felt his gaze on my back long after I'd rounded the next corner. I shrugged it off. Probably just a weirdo. There's always someone out here who doesn't quite fit, right? I kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. Maybe it was how still he had been. People shift their weight, scratch their head, breathe. He hadn't done any of that. I set up camp a few miles down the trail, the unease still gnawing at the back of my mind. I told myself it was nothing, that I'd probably never see him again. I made a fire, ate my dinner, and tried to relax. Then, just as the sun was sinking below the horizon, I heard footsteps. Not the quick, rhythmic steps of a hiker. These were slow, deliberate, like someone was taking their time. My breath caught in my throat. I turned, and there he was again, standing at the edge of the trees. No pack, no supplies, just him. He didn't come any closer. He just stood there, watching me, like before. Only this time, there was no smile. His eyes were dark, shadowed, and his mouth was a flat line. I called out, "Can I help you?" Nothing. Not a word. A chill ran down my spine. The air seemed to thicken, the sounds of the forest dimming. I couldn't even hear the wind in the trees anymore. Everything was just quiet, too quiet. I told myself to stay calm. People are strange sometimes, right? Maybe he was just lost or disoriented. Maybe he needed help. But something in my gut told me to get out of there. I began packing up my things as casually as I could, pretending I wasn't freaked out. I shoved my gear into my pack, keeping one eye on him. He didn't move, just watched, like he was waiting for something. When I slung my pack over my shoulder and stood up, his eyes followed me again. It felt like they were burning holes through me. I walked away, slow at first, but as soon as I was out of sight, I picked up the pace. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing. Was he following me? The trail was narrow, winding through thick trees, the branches casting long, twisted shadows in the fading light. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him lurking just behind me, but the trail was empty. I didn't stop until I'd put a few miles between me and my campsite. My legs were aching, and my lungs burned from the cold air, but I wasn't going to stop. Not yet. Not until I was sure I'd lost him. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, methodical. I dove off the trail, scrambling behind a thick clump of trees and shrubs, crouching down as quietly as I could. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I peeked through the branches, my breath catching in my throat. There he was, walking slowly down the trail, his eyes scanning the trees, looking for me. I stayed frozen in place, hardly daring to breathe. He walked right past my hiding spot, just a few feet away, his face expressionless, his eyes dark pits. And then he stopped, right in front of me. I swear he could sense me. I could feel the air shift around him, like the forest itself was holding its breath. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his head tilting slightly, as if listening for something. Then, finally, he kept walking, his footsteps fading into the distance. I waited until I couldn't hear him anymore, and then I bolted. I didn't care about the trail anymore, I just needed to get away. I crashed through the trees, branches scraping my skin, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I saw the lights of a small ranger station in the distance. I reported the incident to the authorities, but they didn't seem concerned. Probably just a local, they said, someone who got lost. But I knew better. There was something wrong with that man. Something not human. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear those footsteps. Slow, deliberate, closer than they should be. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, my first one on my own. A rite of passage, really. Just me, a borrowed tent, and the promise of some peace and quiet away from the humdrum of daily life. I had chosen a campground far enough from the city to feel isolated, but not too far. A delicate balance for a first-timer like me, just close enough to civilization to feel safe, but remote enough to breathe deeply for the first time in months. The place was semi-crowded when I arrived, which brought me some comfort. I wasn't quite ready for full-blown wilderness. Families cooked hot dogs over flickering fires, kids zipped by on bikes, and I could hear the low hum of conversations blending into the crackle of firewood. It was picturesque, exactly what I'd hoped for. I pitched my tent, awkward and slow at first, but I got the hang of it. As I stood back to admire my work, a man appeared from between the trees. I hadn't heard him approach, which was odd considering the dry leaves that littered the ground. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and a grin that never seemed to reach his eyes. "Hey there," he said. "First time camping?" I nodded, trying to act casual, but something about him set me on edge. He introduced himself as TJ. His voice was calm, measured, like he had all the time in the world. Too calm, really. I chalked it up to the isolation. People act differently in the woods, they shed the frantic energy of the city, right? I tried to convince myself that was all it was. But TJ lingered, standing too close for comfort, his eyes too fixed on me. "You ever been to the hidden lake?" he asked, his voice dropping into something that felt more like a dare than a question. I hadn't heard of any hidden lake. I shook my head, wishing he'd take the hint and move along, but curiosity gnawed at me. Maybe there was something to this place beyond the crowded campground, something real, something untamed. I swallowed down the unease creeping up my spine and asked, "Is it far?" He smiled then, wide and toothy, his teeth gleaming a little too white in the dimming light. "Nah, not far. You just have to know where to look." Against my better judgment, I agreed. Why? I still don't know. Maybe it was the allure of some secret place no one else knew about, or maybe it was the way he made it sound so. Inevitable, like the lake was something I had to see, whether I wanted to or not. We left the campground behind, walking in silence. At first, I tried to make conversation, ask him where he was from, what brought him out here. But TJ didn't answer much, just grunted or gave one-word replies. The farther we walked, the more the air seemed to thicken, the trees closing in like they were bending toward us. TJ walked ahead, moving with that strange, unhurried ease, but something about his gait seemed off, like he wasn't leading me to a lake at all. I started to regret coming. The sky was shifting into shades of purple and orange, the light bleeding away too quickly. I glanced around, hoping to see some sign of water, but the trees just grew denser, their shadows stretching long and menacing. How much further, I finally asked, trying to sound casual, but the edge in my voice betrayed me. TJ didn't answer. He didn't even look back. A sickening realization hit me that I hadn't seen a single marker, no trail signs, nothing to indicate anyone had ever been this way before. And TJ, well, I hadn't seen a tent, had I? He just appeared, like the woods had spat him out, a phantom conjured by the dusk. I slowed my pace, and TJ, sensing it, stopped too. He turned, but his face was different now, harder, the grin gone. His eyes, once disinterested, were sharp, predatory. He looked past me at the fading light, like he was waiting for something. Or maybe he was waiting for the darkness itself. Panic bloomed in my chest. I tried to laugh it off, made some excuse about needing to head back, but TJ didn't move. He just stood there, staring, his hand twitching towards something at his waist. Run, my brain screamed, but my legs felt like they were stuck in the earth, like the trees themselves were holding me in place. Then TJ moved. It wasn't a lunge, not at first. It was more deliberate than that, like he knew he didn't have to rush. I stumbled back, my heart thundering in my chest. Finally, my legs responded, and I turned, bolting through the trees, not caring which way I was going, just away from him, away from whatever he had in mind. Branches whipped at my face, thorns scratched my arms, but I didn't stop. I could hear him behind me, his footfalls steady, not frantic. He was toying with me, enjoying the chase. Then something whizzed past my ear, a blade, catching the last bit of twilight before it embedded itself into a tree trunk ahead of me. He had thrown a knife. I didn't look back. I just kept running, praying to whatever might be out there in the wilderness that I'd find my way back. By some miracle, I stumbled into the campground, breathless and shaking. People stared as I collapsed near the fire pit, but I couldn't explain what had happened, not right then. When I finally caught my breath, I told someone to call the police. TJ was still out there, after all. The police came, asked me 1,000 questions. They searched, of course, but they didn't find anything. No man, no tent, no knife. It was as if TJ had never existed. But I know what I saw. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see him, standing just at the edge of the trees, waiting for the darkness to fall again. It was late, far too late to be wide awake, but sleep never came easy when you were out in the middle of nowhere, alone. The kind of alone that sinks into your bones and makes every crackle of firewood or snap of a branch feel like it means something more. And out here, in the heart of Montana, where the only other soul for miles could be a passing grizzly, or maybe if you were really lucky, an old hunter, it felt like the very land itself was watching. I'd parked my camper by a stream, thinking it would lull me to sleep, but the quiet was louder than I expected. I'd made a small fire, not so much for warmth, but for the light, something to break the dark that pressed against me from all sides. The shadows of the pines stretched long and jagged, swaying with the wind, as if they had a life of their own. That's when I heard it. The low rumble of an engine came creeping through the stillness, the sound foreign, invasive. I sat up straight, staring into the black, my heartbeat quickening. I wasn't expecting company, and out here, uninvited guests rarely brought good news. The truck came into view, its headlights cutting a harsh line through the darkness. It stopped just at the edge of the clearing where I'd set up camp, idling like a predator sizing up its prey. 2 men got out, slow and deliberate, their silhouettes towering in the dim light of the fire. They were carrying something, tools. It looked like heavy, blunt things that glinted under the stars. My stomach tightened, a knot of cold dread forming at the base of my spine. They didn't speak. That was the part that unnerved me the most. No loud banter, no drunken hollering like you'd expect from someone stumbling across a campsite. Just silence. One of them tapped a wrench against his palm, a casual gesture that felt anything but. The other was fiddling with the camper's lock, his movements methodical, like he'd done this 100 times before. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a primal fear I hadn't known I was capable of feeling. My mind raced. What could I do? I wasn't armed, not really. A pocket knife wasn't going to do much good against two men, especially not these two, who looked like they could snap me in half without breaking a sweat. The woods felt impossibly vast around me, and I realized just how small I was, how alone I'd chosen to be out here, away from the world. A mistake. God, it had been such a stupid mistake. They were getting closer, moving toward the door of the camper now, tools in hand. I could hear the faint scrape of metal on metal as one of them wedged something into the lock. My pulse hammered in my ears, each thud a reminder that time was slipping away, that whatever came next would be out of my control. And then out of nowhere it came. A gunshot cracked through the night like a whip. It echoed off the trees, bouncing through the forest, and for a split second, everything stopped. The men froze, their heads snapping toward the woods as if the trees themselves had opened fire. I didn't know where it came from, who it came from, but it didn't matter. In that moment, it was salvation. The two men exchanged a glance, something passed between them, fear. Maybe, and without a word, they turned and bolted back to their truck, leaving their tools scattered on the ground. The engine roared to life, tires kicking up dirt as they sped off into the night, swallowed by the shadows from which they came. I didn't move, not for a long time. My body was still shaking, a strange mixture of adrenaline and terror coursing through my veins. I glanced toward the woods, the source of the shot, but saw nothing. No movement, no figure emerging from the trees. Just the steady rustle of leaves in the wind, like nothing had happened at all. Was it a hunter? Some stranger out there keeping an eye on things? Or was it something else, something watching me, making sure I stayed alive just long enough to leave? I didn't know, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I gathered my things in a blind rush, shoving them into the back of the camper with shaking hands. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dull red glow over the clearing. I kicked dirt over it, smothering what little light was left. As I slammed the camper door shut, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were still watching, still waiting. The gunshot saved me, I'm sure of that. But the question that will haunt me for the rest of my life is who fired it, and why were they there? I drove through the night, the road stretching endlessly before me, each mile taking me further from the clearing, but not from the memory. That place, those men, and whoever or whatever had kept me alive would stay with me. Always. Pearl, out here, in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, you never really know who or what is watching. We'd been planning this camping trip for months. Rachel and I, looking for an escape from our drab suburban life, had set our sights on the Appalachian Mountains, convinced that the dense forests and rolling mists would be just what we needed to rekindle our connection. The air was fresh, the trees were ancient, and the nights were dark and still. It was supposed to be the perfect retreat. We pitched our tent on the edge of a secluded clearing, the kind of spot that made you feel like you were alone in the world. The first night passed with the usual rustlings and creaks of the forest, nothing that would disturb a good night's sleep. But on the second night, things took a turn. It was just after dusk when they appeared two men, appearing almost out of nowhere, like shadows materializing from the fog. At first, I thought they were just fellow campers, but their behavior was unsettling. They didn't talk, didn't make any effort to approach or introduce themselves. They simply stood there, a good 100 yards away, watching us. Their eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness, unblinking, fixed on us with a cold intensity that made my skin crawl. Rachel noticed them too. She tried to brush it off, but I could see the way her eyes darted toward them, her unease palpable. We made a show of starting a fire, laughing and joking, as if to ward off the creeping sensation that we were being observed by something malevolent. The firelight flickered and danced, casting eerie shadows that seemed to distort the figures of the men into grotesque shapes. As the night deepened, so did our sense of dread. We kept catching glimpses of them, always in the periphery of our vision, standing still as if they were rooted to the ground. Every crack of a twig, every whisper of the wind through the trees made my heart pound harder. The forest, once inviting, now felt like a prison. By midnight, the fire had died down to embers, and a heavy silence had settled over the campsite. Rachel and I huddled in our sleeping bags, too frightened to sleep, the cold seeping into our bones. The men were still there, still watching, their presence almost palpable. My mind raced with thoughts of what they could possibly want, and every scenario that played out in my head was darker than the last. Then, without warning, the silence was shattered. The distinct sound of footsteps crunching on dry leaves came from the direction of the two men. We froze, our breath held. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right on top of us. We heard their muffled voices, but we couldn't make out the words. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave. "Get up," I hissed to Rachel, my voice barely more than a whisper. She was already scrambling out of her sleeping bag, her eyes wide with terror. We grabbed our flashlights and stumbled out of the tent, the forest enveloping us in a suffocating darkness. We ran, not daring to look back, but knowing with every step that those men were still there, still watching. The only sound was our frantic breathing and the pounding of our hearts. Branches slapped against our faces, and the uneven ground threatened to trip us up, but we kept moving, driven by a primal fear. We finally reached the clearing where we had pitched our tent, our breath ragged and our bodies shaking. The men were gone, their shadows swallowed by the forest. I glanced around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and that's when I saw an old leather satchel lying in the dirt, its contents scattered. It belonged to the old man who used to live nearby, a recluse, whose disappearance had been a local mystery. The realization hit us with full force. Those men hadn't been lost campers. They were something else, something that had claimed the old man, something that had been waiting for us to make the same mistake he had. We had narrowly escaped a fate that now seemed all too real. The weight of our near miss pressed heavily on us as we packed up the campsite and fled the mountains. Even now, as I sit here, the memory of those unblinking eyes, the ghostly figures standing still in the darkness, still sends shivers down my spine. It wasn't just the terror of what might have happened, it was the dread of knowing that something was out there, always watching, waiting for its next prey. And the worst part, the feeling that it might not be finished with us yet. It was supposed to be a day like any other, a rare slice of solitude carved out of my cluttered life. I'd been planning this solo hike for weeks, a chance to clear my mind in the crisp, unblemished air of the woods. The trees stood tall and silent, their shadows dancing across the path as I walked, each step a balm to my frayed nerves. But peace is a fickle thing. The encounter began as innocuously as a leaf falling from a tree. I was rounding a bend, my breath coming in gentle puffs, when I saw him. He was standing on the trail ahead, as if he'd been waiting there for an eternity. The stranger was tall, gaunt, with an expression that twisted somewhere between a smirk and a sneer. His clothes were dark, too dark for the day's light, and he held something in his outstretched hand, a wallet. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice piercing the calm like a knife. "I seem to have lost something. Can you help me?" There was something off about him, something that set the hairs on the back of my neck on edge. I forced a smile, more out of politeness than anything else. "Sure, what's the problem?" He didn't move, just held that wallet out as though it was the most precious thing in the world. "I found this," he said, his voice carrying an unsettling sweetness. "I thought it might belong to you." I took a step closer, my instincts screaming at me to turn around and walk away. The wallet was an empty shell, its contents long gone. I glanced at the stranger's face, and the smile there was unsettling, like he knew a dark secret I didn't. "It's not mine," I said, but before I could retreat, he was stepping closer, his eyes never leaving mine. His eyes were like pits, dark and endless, pulling me in with a gravity I couldn't resist. "Please take it," he urged, his hand insistent. "You might need it. You never know." His insistence was more than uncomfortable, it was menacing. Against my better judgment, I took the wallet. His touch was cold, sending a shiver up my spine. "Thanks," I mumbled, desperate to escape this strange interaction. I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me again. "I have a feeling you'll be needing that," he said cryptically. His voice carried a warning I couldn't decipher, but I chose to ignore it. I quickened my pace, eager to put distance between us. The forest had never seemed so dense, the shadows more oppressive. As I approached my car, parked in the small clearing, I heard a rustling behind me. My heart thudded in my chest as I spun around, but there was no one there. I reached for my keys, fumbling as I tried to unlock the door. A twig snapped behind me, and I whipped around again. That's when I saw him. The stranger was emerging from the trees, his face now a mask of grim determination. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The wallet seemed to weigh a ton in my hand. He moved toward me with a deliberate, almost predatory grace. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his tone chillingly calm. I could see the faint glint of something sharp in his hand. Was it a knife? My heart raced, and my mind scrambled for a plan. Instinct kicked in. I darted to the side, scrambling for my car door, but he was quicker than I'd anticipated. He lunged for me, but I managed to slam the door shut just in time. I locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. From inside the car, I watched as he paced around, his eyes fixed on me with a hunger I couldn't quite understand. He muttered something under his breath, his expression twisted into a grimace of frustration. I held my breath, praying he would just leave. After what felt like an eternity, he finally turned and disappeared back into the trees. I waited, my hands trembling, before I dared to get out of the car. I didn't see him again, but the forest felt darker now, as if the trees themselves were whispering of the strange encounter. As I drove away, the wallet lay on the passenger seat, a silent witness to the encounter. Its emptiness seemed to mock me, a reminder of how close I'd come to something truly sinister. I couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger's presence had been more than a mere coincidence, that there had been something darker, more insidious lurking beneath that eerie smile. My hike had been cut short, but the true terror was only beginning. The forest, the wallet, and that unsettling smile had left a scar that would never quite fade. I'd always preferred the solitude of solo hikes, the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant call of wildlife. It was supposed to be an escape from the noise of the city, a retreat into the calming embrace of nature. But that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows began to stretch long and thin, I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. I'd come across him on a narrow, winding trail. He was a hiker, like me, but something about him was off. He had a gaunt look, his clothes too new for someone who'd been out here for a while, and those eyes dark, unreadable. He asked me about my group. I was alone, and I didn't like how his gaze lingered on me as he inquired, as if he was weighing my words. "Just me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why do you ask?" "Oh, just curious," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You know how it is sometimes you run into people you don't expect to." His tone was too casual, too easy. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest like a cold weight. As I continued my hike, I kept glancing back, half expecting to see him trailing behind. But the trail was empty, just the whispering trees in the growing dark. By the time I set up camp, the sun had vanished completely, leaving the forest in a cloak of darkness. I chose a spot off the trail, away from prying eyes, or so I thought. The eerie quiet of the forest was unsettling. It felt as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting. As I settled into my tent, the sound of footsteps began a rhythmic, deliberate crunch of leaves. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way it was an animal. These were human footsteps, and they were close. The noise came and went, sometimes lingering just outside the tent, other times moving off into the distance before returning. I lay there trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the weight of the silence was crushing. I could almost hear the breath of whoever was out there, waiting. As hours ticked by, the footsteps continued, each sound a reminder that I was not alone. The rustling outside was relentless, the anticipation unbearable. I could picture them outside, dark shapes lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight, watching, waiting. It was a game, a sick, twisted game, and I was the unwitting player. I couldn't take it anymore. With my heart in my throat, I unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The forest was as dark as a grave, the trees casting long, sinister shadows. There was no one there. I saw only the tangled undergrowth and the occasional flicker of moonlight through the leaves. The silence was almost more terrifying than the footsteps. By dawn, I packed up as quickly as I could. Every crackle of a twig underfoot, every rustle of leaves was a potential threat. As I hiked out, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that gaunt figure from the trail emerging from the woods. The tension was unbearable, my senses heightened, each sound amplified by the fear that still clung to me. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw the familiar sight of parked cars and hikers chatting and laughing, I felt a wave of relief. But that relief was short-lived. The whole way home, a gnawing dread sat in the pit of my stomach. The feeling that I had been watched, observed by something or someone lurking just out of sight, wouldn't leave me. I knew I had escaped barely, but the haunting whisper of those footsteps would stay with me. The forest had its secrets, and I was now part of them. I had left the woods behind, but they had not let me go. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the air feels heavy with anticipation, and the sky outside my window was painted in hues of orange and purple as the sun sank beneath the horizon. I was 16, alone in the house for the first time since my parents had started leaving me home alone while they ran errands or went to work. Dad had a late shift that night, and Mom was out with friends, leaving me in charge of our modest two-story home. I had just settled into the couch with my favorite video game when I heard it, the distinct creak of the garage door. It wasn't the kind of creak that comes from wear and tear. It was the kind that made your spine tingle and your heart start hammering in your chest. I glanced at the clock. Dad's shift wouldn't end for another 2 hours. My mind raced. What if it was one of Dad's friends messing around? Or worse, someone who shouldn't be there at all? The sound started again. The garage door opened and closed, followed by the shuffle of footsteps. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling or a stray animal scurrying about, but the sense of dread gnawed at me, growing with every second. I decided to investigate. I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet, and crept toward the source of the noise. I reached the garage and paused, my hand on the doorknob. The door was slightly ajar, and a sliver of darkness peeked through. I took a deep breath and pushed it open. The garage was empty, but my senses were on high alert. The sound of someone or something shuffling around in the darkness was unmistakable. I scanned the room, my eyes darting over the clutter of old boxes and rusty tools. Everything seemed normal, too normal. I turned to leave, but then I saw it. A shadow darted across the window at the far end of the garage. It was too quick, too deliberate to be an innocent trick of the light. My heart was racing, and panic started to set in. I bolted back inside, locking the door behind me. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. I locked myself in the bathroom, my mind racing through every horror movie I'd ever seen. I could hear the faint sounds of movement outside the door, the soft scrape of something or someone trying to get in. I pressed my back against the door, the cold tile pressing against me as I clutched the baseball bat like a lifeline. My phone was useless. The battery had died hours ago. The only sound I could hear was the thudding of my own heartbeat and the occasional creak from somewhere deep in the house. I tried to stay calm, to think logically, but fear clouded my thoughts. Every creak of the house seemed like a prelude to something far worse. Minutes felt like hours. I don't know how long I stayed there, locked away in that tiny bathroom, but when I heard the distant sound of a car engine revving up and then fading away, I took a deep breath and slowly opened the door. The house was silent. I crept through the rooms, checking every corner with a heightened sense of paranoia. I finally reached the front door and fled outside. My neighbor, Mr. Johnson, was a retired police officer. I pounded on his door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. He answered quickly, his face turning serious when I explained what happened. Without hesitation, he called the police. It wasn't long before they arrived and apprehended the intruder. They found him hiding in the bushes across the street, and it turned out he had been scouting our neighborhood for weeks, looking for an opportunity. My parents came home soon after, their faces pale with worry. We all huddled together, relieved that I was unharmed. In the days that followed, the sense of violation never truly left me. We upgraded our home security and took every precaution to ensure we'd never feel that kind of fear again. The house felt different now, emptier, colder. Every creak, every shadow, every sound seemed to carry the memory of that night. The fear had a way of lingering, of twisting the mundane into something sinister. As for me, I learned that night that sometimes the most terrifying things aren't the monsters you see, but the ones lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And those shadows, they're always closer than you think. It was one of those chill-drenched nights that make you question why you ever left the warmth of your bed. I'd been slogging through deliveries for DoorDash, the kind of shift that makes you wonder if you're part of some cosmic joke. The office building on my last delivery was one of those old, creaky structures that looked like it hadn't seen a coat of paint since the 80s. The kind that whispers secrets to itself when the wind howls just right. I pulled up to the building, the flickering streetlight casting long, jittery shadows on the pavement. My phone buzzed with the delivery details, directing me to the address on the second floor. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first, save for the silence. An unnatural silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up like a choir of tiny, invisible fingers. A man stepped out from the darkness, emerging from an alcove so subtly that he might have just materialized. He was disheveled, his clothes a mess of stained fabric, and his eyes glinting with something that felt more like hunger than hospitality. His face was half hidden by a moth-eaten hat that made him look like a character out of a forgotten noir film. "Delivery for Carter?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as I glanced around for a sign of life. The man's smile was thin, his teeth yellowed, and his eyes, Oh, his eyes, they seemed to be searching for something in the distance, something I couldn't see. Yes, yes, up the stairs. Second floor, he said, his voice a low rasp that didn't quite reach my ears, but seemed to echo inside my head. A chill ran down my spine. I've made deliveries to strange places before, but this was different. The building felt like a tomb, every creak and groan magnified by the oppressive silence. My instincts were screaming at me to get out, but I convinced myself it was just the late hour playing tricks on my mind. I carried the food up the stairs, each step feeling like a step closer to some unknown, lurking dread. The second floor was a corridor of darkened offices, their doors shut tight, as if in solemn protest against the night. There was something profoundly wrong here, an unsettling emptiness that hung in the air like a stale breath. My footsteps echoed too loudly, a stark contrast to the silence that swallowed them up. As I walked down the corridor, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. It was just a shadow, but it seemed to shift and twist in ways that shadows shouldn't. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the office where I was supposed to make the delivery. The door was slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. A sudden noise, a rustling from inside the office, made me freeze. I was alone, and the only response was the hum of an old, dying fluorescent light somewhere far down the hall. Panic clawed at my throat, and I bolted. No delivery, no tip, no amount of money was worth what I felt creeping up my spine. I fled down the stairs and out of that building, the cold night air never feeling so welcome. My mind raced with what I'd seen, or rather, what I hadn't seen but felt. The shadow on the second floor had a presence, an intelligence that was malevolent and predatory. The next day, the police were at my door. They wanted to question me about a break-in at that same building. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather settled over me as they spoke. The man I'd seen was part of a group planning something deeply sinister. Something that involved more than just a late-night snack run. The other drivers, they told me, had done the smart thing. They'd left their deliveries outside, avoiding the building altogether. I didn't know what they had seen or what had driven their instinct to stay away, but I wished I'd been as wise. My delivery, that night, had barely been a delivery at all. Now, when I think back to that night, it's not just the shadow on the second floor that haunts me, but the realization that some places, some buildings are better left alone. The dark secrets they hide are not just for show, they're real, and they wait for someone foolish enough to come too close. As for me, I learned that sometimes the best decision is to listen to that nagging feeling in the pit of your stomach. It might just save your life. It was past midnight, and the grocery store was swallowed by darkness save for the flickering fluorescence that hummed overhead. I had been working the graveyard shift alone for weeks, which, to be honest, suited me just fine. There's a peculiar peace in the emptiness of the aisles, in the muted rustle of cans and the occasional groan of the aging refrigeration units. But tonight, the peace was shattered by an unsettling thud against the store's plate glass window. I turned slowly, bracing myself for the usual late-night pranksters or bored teenagers, but the sight that met me made my blood run cold. A disheveled man, his clothes were a patchwork of dirt and grime, was pounding on the window with a wild desperation. His eyes, wide and unhinged, seemed to bore straight through the glass into my soul. I felt a shiver snake down my spine, but curiosity, or maybe stupidity, had me inching closer. "Help me," he screamed, his voice distorted by the glass, a grotesque echo in the silent store. His hands were shaking violently, and the glass reverberated with each thud. Something about his appearance, the unkempt hair, the jagged beard, and the hollow-eyed stare set my nerves on edge. I tried to remain calm, but there was a tension in the air that felt like a taut wire ready to snap. I picked up the store's intercom and tried to reach the security company. Static crackled back at me, of course. The store's intercom system had been acting up for days. I ran my fingers over the lock of the front door, my breath hitching as I realized it had been tampered with. Scratches and dents marred the surface. The man outside had made his way inside. A sudden chill ran through me, and I glanced towards the security cameras positioned in the corners of the store. Their red lights blinked back at me with a malignancy I hadn't noticed before. I could see the man's shadow, now moving inside, pacing with a frantic energy. In the blink of an eye, the old van parked outside, its rusty frame barely visible in the dim light, screeched away, leaving nothing but the fading echo of its engine. My heart raced. I had to get out of there. I bolted through the stockroom, pushing past pallets and boxes, my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The store's main door, still locked, was my only escape route, and as I fumbled with the keys, a cold, sweaty panic seized me. I yanked the door open and stumbled into the cool night air, only then allowing myself a breath of relief. But relief was fleeting. I glanced back at the store and saw, through the glass doors, a shadowy figure standing in aisle 4, an impossibly tall and thin silhouette that seemed to stretch and twist in ways that defied reason. I didn't wait to see more. I ran to my car, nearly tripping over my own feet. The next morning I checked the security footage. The cameras had captured the man, his face eerily distorted by the low-quality feed moving with deliberate purpose through the aisles. And then there were others, creeping in and out of view. A group. Their faces hidden, their movements practiced and unsettlingly synchronized. I reported the incident to the authorities, who, after reviewing the footage, suggested it was a case of attempted abduction. They didn't know who the group was or what their motives were. They only knew that my quick thinking and the unlikely chance of my escape had saved me from a fate that was likely grim. In the days that followed, the store's security system was overhauled and extra precautions were taken. Yet the memory of that night clung to me like a persistent shadow. The face of that man, his wild eyes and frantic banging haunted my dreams, and the silhouette in aisle 4 lingered in the edges of my vision, like a dark stain that refused to wash away. And now, every time I walk past that old grocery store, even if it's in broad daylight, I can't help but feel a shiver. It's as if the store still holds the echoes of that night, the vibrations of fear reverberating through its empty aisles. The shadows seem darker, the silence thicker. It's a reminder that even in the mundane, danger can lurk just beyond the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. I was supposed to be alone in the wild, not haunted by shadows. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat into the heart of Utah's wilderness, a break from the incessant buzz of city life. But as I pitched my tent beneath a sky spattered with stars, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It was an odd sensation, one that wormed its way into your bones and settled there, a persistent itch that no amount of scratching could alleviate. At first, I dismissed it as nothing more than the overactive imagination of someone who'd spent too many hours alone in the woods. I told myself that I was just jumpy, that the creaks and whispers of the forest were merely the symphony of nature, but deep down, a gnawing anxiety refused to be silenced. It wasn't until dusk fell that I got my first real glimpse of the man or whatever he was. I'd just started a fire, the flames crackling and dancing in the gathering gloom, when I noticed him standing there at the edge of the clearing. He was cloaked in shadow, his features indistinguishable, but there was something undeniably unsettling about him. He was watching me, and as our eyes met, a chill washed over me that had nothing to do with the evening air. I squinted, trying to make out any details, but the darkness was thick, oppressive. Then, just as quickly as he appeared, he melted back into the forest, leaving only the echo of his presence behind. I thought about grabbing my flashlight and going after him, but something held me back. It was the kind of feeling that whispered, "Don't go looking for trouble, trouble will find you." Night fell. and with it came a heavy silence that seemed to press down on my campsite like a suffocating blanket. I tried to sleep, but every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves made my heart race. The forest, which had seemed so serene during the day, now felt like a labyrinth of nightmares, each shadow a potential threat. I must have drifted off at some point, because when I woke, the first thing I noticed was an icy draft creeping through the tent. It took me a moment to realize why. There, in the darkness, two small, reflective spots glimmered with an eerie, otherworldly light. They were eyes, unblinking and filled with a kind of predatory hunger. Panic surged through me like an electric shock. My hands fumbled for the bear spray I'd kept close at hand, a last line of defense against the wild creatures of the forest. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fumbled with the canister, finally managing to pull the safety tab and spray the contents into the darkness. The hiss of the spray was like a roar in the silence, and the eyes, those haunting eyes, vanished almost instantly. I scrambled out of the tent, my mind a maelstrom of fear and confusion. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest as I packed up my gear with frantic, trembling hands. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified, every rustle and creak a reminder of the unseen menace lurking in the shadows. By the time I was done, the first hints of dawn were beginning to break through the trees. I raced to my truck, my legs feeling like lead, and hit the gas as soon as I was behind the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I finally managed to call the police. They came out to the campsite, but of course there was no trace of the man or whatever he had been. They offered a cursory investigation and a few words of comfort, but I knew they thought I was just another camper with an overactive imagination. They didn't see what I saw, and they didn't feel what I felt. The drive home was a blur, and when I finally stumbled through my front door, I felt as though I'd narrowly escaped some unspeakable horror. To this day, I can't shake the memory of those eyes, or the eerie feeling of being watched. It was as if something was waiting in the darkness, just beyond the edge of the firelight, waiting for the perfect moment to make its move. And though I try to tell myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the light and shadows, I know deep down that I'll never be able to forget those eyes. They are a part of me now, a reminder that in the dark corners of the world, there are things that watch and wait, hidden just out of sight, ready to come crawling out when you least expect it. It was one of those late night shifts where the world feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. I was behind the counter at the gas station, a barely lit island of fluorescent light in a sea of darkness. The kind of darkness that makes you question if you're really alone, or if something's just lurking beyond the edge of your vision. The clock ticked louder than usual tonight, each second dragging its feet, and I was flipping through the pages of a dog-eared magazine to keep my eyes open. My mind was half on the pages, half on the empty lot outside, where the only company was a flickering streetlight and the occasional passing car. Then I noticed an unfamiliar car parked outside, a beat-up old sedan that looked like it had seen better days. It was strange, because the station rarely saw visitors this late, especially ones with such a nondescript vehicle. Its dull gray paint job was faded, almost as if it was trying to blend into the night itself. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that settled over me. The station had been quiet for hours, and I didn't want to let this random car mess with my calm. I went back to my magazine, but the occasional creak of the floorboards made me look up now and then. Then he walked in. No sound, no doorbell ringing. He just appeared from nowhere, as though he'd been materialized by the darkness itself. His clothes were out of place, a tattered trench coat that looked as if it had been through more than its fair share of bad weather and worse company. His face was shadowed by a hat that drooped over his eyes, making it impossible to see his expression. He moved with an unsettling calm, gliding down the aisles without making a sound. There was something wrong about the way he walked, like he was trying too hard to be unnoticed. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, my heart hammering in my chest. My fingers twitched near the button for the silent alarm, just in case. He picked up a pack of gum, though he didn't seem particularly interested in it. After a moment of examining it, he dropped it back on the counter and continued his way to the door. It was the kind of gesture that felt rehearsed, like he was putting on a show. As he left, he glanced back at me for a fraction of a second. I could have sworn I saw something in his eyes, something dark and hollow. But before I could register it properly, he was gone, the door swinging closed with a soft whoosh. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to follow him, but the other part knew better. I called the police, feeling the words stick in my throat as I explained the situation. They arrived quickly, but by then, the car was gone, and the only evidence that anything had happened was the empty parking space where the sedan had been. A few hours later, the police called back. The car was stolen, they said. They didn't have much to go on, no ID, no fingerprints, just a vague description of the man who had driven it. They were as clueless as I was about his intentions. As the sun began to rise, casting its early light on the gas station's grimy windows, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The kind of chill that makes you question what you thought you knew about safety and security. That day, as I left the station, I glanced back at the spot where the strange car had been. I thought about the man in the trench coat and the hollow look in his eyes. I didn't know what he had been up to, and maybe I didn't want to know. But one thing was clear: the darkness had seeped into my quiet, late-night world, and I wasn't sure if it would ever let go. It was one of those nights that was meant for simple pleasures: a cold beer, the glow of the TV, and the kind of lazy solitude that only comes when you're alone in the house. The clock had just struck midnight when the silence of my apartment was punctured by a noise. At first, it was so faint that I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a stray sound from the old pipes. I brushed it off with a shake of my head and a swig from my bottle. But then the sound came again. This time, there was no mistaking it. It was a light, rhythmic thump, like footsteps coming from the room directly above me. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was nothing more than the creak of the house settling, an old home's nocturnal sigh. I took another sip, trying to focus on the banal hum of late-night television. The thumping grew louder, more insistent. It was clear now someone or something was walking around upstairs. My initial irritation turned to a cold prickle of unease. My roommate was out of town, and I was alone in this creaking old place. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the footsteps were growing more deliberate, more rhythmic. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I set my beer aside and climbed the stairs, the old wood groaning under my weight. I felt a shiver run down my spine, like the unseen eyes of something watching me from the darkness. The upper floor was bathed in shadow. I flicked on the light, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. The hallway stretched out before me, and I hesitated for a moment, gathering my courage. I began with the room directly above the stairs. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, revealing an empty room, a stark contrast to the rhythmic noise I'd heard. There was no sign of disturbance. I moved to my roommate's room, which was closed. I turned the handle and pushed the door open with a creak. Inside, the room was pristine. Everything was in its place. My roommate's bed was neatly made, and the room was as undisturbed as if no one had ever been there. I stood there for a moment, feeling a strange mixture of relief and frustration. I turned off the light and closed the door softly behind me, making my way back downstairs. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the thumping resumed. It was as if whatever had been upstairs was now right behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. The noise was louder now, almost frantic. It seemed to come from the ceiling directly above me, as if something was moving in the space above. I dashed to the front door, half expecting to find someone waiting outside, but there was no one. The silence of the night outside was almost deafening. I returned to the living room, my hands shaking, my beer forgotten on the table. The noise stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was worse than the noise had been. I sat there, trying to calm my racing thoughts, my eyes darting to every shadow, every creak of the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Hours passed. I had no idea what time it was when I heard the familiar sound of the front door opening. My roommate had returned, oblivious to the horrors I'd just experienced. I jumped up, rushing to greet them with a mix of relief and anxiety. "What's wrong?" they asked, noticing my disheveled appearance and the frantic look in my eyes. I thought I heard something, I said, trying to sound calm, though my voice trembled. "Upstairs." It sounded like footsteps. My roommate frowned. "I've been gone all night," they said. "I left the place locked up tight." I tried to explain, but the words felt hollow. We went upstairs together, the silence now heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. The rooms were as I had left them. Everything was perfectly in place. My roommate looked at me with concern. "Maybe you were just tired," they suggested. "It's an old house. Things creak." I nodded, but the unease remained. As they settled in, I found myself unable to sleep. The sound of footsteps still echoed in my mind, a reminder that something unseen had been lurking in the shadows of my home. Even now, as I lie here, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. The house is silent again, but the silence is different, pregnant with a tension that makes my skin crawl. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear it again, the soft, rhythmic thumping from the stairs above.